Assalamu alaikum and welcome back guys to Engineering Geology GS119. My name is Engineer Abid Ali and our topic for today is about weathering, erosion and deposition. So in this lecture we are going to talk about the weathering, erosion and deposition. Let's begin with some simple definition of these three terms. So weathering is, in this sense, is the breaking down and changing of rock as a result of exposure to the environment. So if I have a large granite in nature and over hundreds and thousands of years the waves of the ocean are crashing onto that rock and the rock is going to break down into smaller pieces, it might get rounded out. It's essentially going to change as a result of exposure to its environment, and that's just one example of what weathering can be. There's a lot of different types. We are going to look at those in this lecture. After rocks are weathered, they are often eroded, and that process, erosion, is the transportation of the sediments that have been broken down by weathering. So if you imagine a little bits of granite that being pounded off of that slab because it's being hit by wave after wave and then being carried away in the ocean current to a different location. Well, the act of carrying those little chunks of granite, those weathered sediments from one place to another place, that is erosion. Erosion is all about the movement and transportation. The final part of this process is called deposition. So the deposition is the dropping off of the sediments that have been weathered and eroded. So to continue my example, if those little tiny bits of granite broken off and weathered by the waves and then eroded or transported by the ocean's current eventually get deposited on a coastline many hundred of miles away, that is deposition and the dropping off. So to kind of summarize these three processes, starting with the weathering, we know is breaking apart of rock, and then erosion, which is the transportation of the sediments, and finally the deposition or the dropping off of those sediments. So another way to think about this is just kind of a quick analogy that it helps me remember the difference between them, is that weathering is like a hammer, right? It's a way of taking bits by bits of rock and smashing them into smaller bits and or changing them into something new. And then erosion is, this example would be something like a dump truck or a pickup truck carrying all the little bits and pieces broken about by weathering from one location to another. And then deposition. Deposition in that dump truck is kind of opening its tailgate or gate and dumping everything out into a big pile on the ground. That's deposition. So that's just kind of a helpful little way to remember the difference is between three parts of this larger weathering, erosion, deposition processes now. So now for the rest of this lecture we are really going to focus on weathering specifically, and we are going to start by looking at the two main types of weathering, and the first example we are going to look at is called physical weathering. Now I just want to point out that physical weathering is also often known as mechanical weathering. Okay, so physical and mechanical are the same thing, and this would be the breakdown of rock into sediments, and the key that it's without changing their composition. So this is literally changing size and shape of the rock. So the waves crashing against a boulder and breaking it into small pebbles that might be rounded out, that physical or mechanical weathering, but it's still, granted, it's not changing the rock or what it's made of, but that does also help in nature. And we have a different type, and that is called chemical weathering. Chemical weathering, so this is when the rocks are changed chemically because of some reaction with usually something like when air or water in nature. So altering of rocks are results of exposure to different substances. So let's that information. So we are breaking down weathering into smaller type. The first type, mechanical weathering, which is the breaking, cracking and grinding, things like that. We all see example of those shortly. And then chemical weathering, which involves some kind of reaction that changes composition. So that's really a key difference between the two types of work. So let's dive a little deeper into our physical or mechanical weathering and look at some different examples. For our purposes, we are going to break this into 4 specific types. Number 1 is called frost action. Number 2 we have exfoliation. Number 3 we have abrasion, and number 4 we call is the root wedging. The frost action, which by the way is also known as the ice wedging, there's a lot of different names for it, and as you might imagine, this involves ice. And so what happens is, take an area that might a little bit about the freezing temperature that day, and you might get rain or maybe some melting snow, and you may have some water that seeps into the cracks within the rock, right? And then the sun sets and the temperature drops off, that water freezes into solid ice. Now you may know already that when water freezes, it expands slightly and it's get a little bit bigger. So as it expands, it's going to be pushing outward on the rock that has seeped into, and that force, believe it or not, is actually strong enough to very slowly and gradually break apart rock, and this process is known as called frost action or ice sweating. So we see example of this in all sort of areas. So we see example of this in all sort of areas where the temperature is a little bit about freezing during the day and then below freezing at night. In effect, a good example is this, that what we call a pothole, which you will see all over the streets, particularly in the springtime. When you have these big fluctuations in temperature, the water actually get into the cracks in the road and then freezes and expands, and then you drive over, and in the next day it just breaks apart and you end up with these big nasty holes in the ground. That's a good example of frost action or ice sweating. Second would be the exfoliation. And this is in a way kind of similar. This involves temperature changes as well as, so this occurs in areas where you have really dramatic temperature changes, where it gets very hot during the day and then very cool at night. The rock itself will actually expand slightly in the heat and then contract in the cool. If this happens day after day and night after night, it weakens the outer layer of the rock until they eventually begin to crack and peel apart like this, or like this right here. It's almost rock is shedding its outer layer and physically or mechanically breaking apart largely as a result of these temperature changes. A third example, which is the most, and we see it all over the world, is called abrasion. So abrasion is basically whenever rock grind against other rock, and it comes in many forms. Like here in the desert, we see a lot of wind abrasion, where gusts of winds will blow grains of sand that crash into other rock and very very slowly over thousands and thousands of years will eventually eat away at the rock. And so wind abrasion is actually responsible for a lot of interesting kind of rock formation that we see in our country and also worldwide. We also can have water or stream abrasion, as little pebbles and sediments are bounced along the bottom of a stream as the water flows, and that's going to eat away the rock that are bouncing over. We also see this on coastline. As I mentioned before, this waves crashing into rocks and grinding it down, carrying little bits of sand and sediments and wood eating away at the rock. Glacier abrasion is very common. Glaciers downhill pulled by gravity, and they scrape along the rock and carve it away over many hundred of. Finally, the last type of physical or mechanical weathering we are going to look at is called root wedging. It's pretty self-explanatory. This is when the plant roots eventually grow within the crack of rock, and as a plant grows larger and larger, they break apart the rock as they grow into, as we see example of this all over the world. And it's amazing how powerful trees roots and plant roots can actually be, so much so that they will physically break apart of rocks as the plant grows. So those are four main examples of weathering. So here's our physical weathering. We are going to add frost action, which is freezing and thawing of ice is going to crack apart rocks. We have exfoliation, which is the alternating hot and cold is going to crack rocks. We have abrasion, which is the grinding of one rock against another, or sand against rock. And then finally root wedging, which would be our plant roots growing into the rocks. And those are four main types of physical weathering. So now let's shift gear and look at the second type of weathering, chemical weathering. So remember, this is the altering or the changing of rock as a result of exposure to different substances. We are going to look at two main examples of this, oxidation and carbonation. We will begin with the oxidation, which is a term you may have heard before. It's the formation of rust, and this is going to occur when the element iron is exposed to oxygen, and that can happen in air or in the water. So we find that there's a lot of rocks around the world that contain large amount of iron, and as that iron reacts with oxygen in air or water, is going to physically rust. The result is that we see rocks that looks like they have been rusted, this orange color to them, and that is actually a form of chemical weathering. This rock is breaking down, the rust is very crumbly, this iron oxide that forms and breaks apart the rock over time. It's actual chemical reaction with oxygen in the air or water. And then finally we have carbonation. Carbonation is really interesting, that this is responsible for the formation of these fascinating, beautifully limestone caves that we see around the world. And it's basically when the water flows through the ground and it reacts with different materials in the soil to create a very mild acid. Mild acid, this carbonatic acid and carbonic acid, is strong enough that if it encounters certain minerals of rock like calcite or limestone, it will eat away or dissolve that limestone, and so that we end up getting these underground caverns where there once we have a large expanse of limestone, but that has all been kind of eaten away slowly by dissolving this carbonic acid. So some of these amazing landscape around the world form as a result of this type of chemical weathering. Another thing that happens when this carbonation is that sometimes the ground will actually give way because all the rock beneath it has been eaten away, and that's when we get something like this, which is called a sinkhole, which is when the rock is gone beneath and the ground collapses above. And so are those two types of chemical weathering, and again we will summarize them. So the first type was oxidation. Iron and oxygen gives you iron oxide or rust, and carbonation, which is when we have this acidic rain and acidic water dissolving limestone and giving us carbon. That would be all for today's lectures. If you guys have any questions, any queries, feel free to contact me through the email or WhatsApp. Take care, stay home, stay safe. That will be all for today.